And we are live.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so this video is a follow-up to the last one, Is Theism Rational? You can find the link to that in the description. So last time, do you remember particularly where you left off, where your headspace was? Because I've got a decent idea, but it's been a little while.
Yeah, so we spent a lot of the time last time talking about the idea that assuming there is some first cause to the universe, the idea that it has to be a personal being, and you gave an argument that it makes the most sense versus like a non-personal mechanistic process being the first cause. And you gave an analogy at the time. You can probably refresh my memory with what it is. Something to do with a man sitting in a chair or getting out of a chair or something like that.
Yeah, I remember.
And
Yeah.
you said one thing that might help you as far as it making more sense that it's a mechanical process of some kind behind it versus a person is if we can come up with a similar kind of analogy of some sort.
Yeah, that kind of points us in the right direction. That's a good point. And I remembered this other one about a sort of non-personal effects in a sort of timeless situation. I remember this other analogy I heard. I wish I could remember where I heard these so I could give proper credit, because I didn't come up with any of these. But something I also want to refresh on the context here is I think there are some to get to where we were at last time. There were a lot of assumptions and steps we had to go to, and I'm going to be the first to admit, at any point, if you kind of pluck one of those pieces of wood out, the whole thing will come tumbling down. So I think a lot of those, like tensed theory of time, principle sufficient reason, like you pluck any of these out, it does come down. And I think that's what, at least in my experience, what I've been reading, a lot of people do. Like, they're just going to deny one of these earlier premises, and that's totally rational. But you do have, like, in a person in my position, we would have to argue for those to be true
Mm-hmm.
in order to get to that. And then another one is, I think, probably the most popular one I've seen is a sort of appeal to ignorance. Like, we just don't know enough about what the beginning of time means, our data on the universe. And I think we talked about that too. So I think those are all very rational positions.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, one of the things when I got to that step, I'm like, okay, I believe in these principles and these assumptions. I don't think they're compelling, but I think they're reasonable to believe. I thought, okay, so I can at least conceive of a man sitting in a chair for, timelessly, even though it's not literally possible. And then if he suddenly wills to stand up, it would create a new event. Time, so to speak, begins. Whereas if you have just impersonal mechanisms in place, they're just timeless. They just statically exist. I remember a different analogy. I wish I would remembered it at the time, about the temperature. Say the temperature was at 0 degrees Celsius for eternity, timelessly 0 degrees Celsius. Any water that was around would be frozen, right? 0 degrees. It would be impossible for the water to just begin to freeze a finite time ago, because there just is no time ago. It was just timeless the whole time. And I thought that would be, if we could make sense of a way of saying water begins to freeze at T equal Tn, whatever that number is, that would kind of be what I'm looking for. I tried to think of a way to make sense of that to myself. I'm like, okay, so it's always 0. Is it possible for water to just start to freeze at a certain point? And something like that. But that was the direction I was trying to go. I was like, is there some way I can make sense of that? So I almost came up with one myself, but I couldn't quite. I didn't finish it. So I don't know, maybe if you have one, or if you have a line of reasoning you want to take me down.
Well, I sent you a text message after the last conversation with this
Oh,
analogy.
right.
It's just like, if you think of, because one kind of objection you had to the idea of a mechanism of some kind is that, what was it? It was that this existence, this existence that was before the universe, was timeless, and that the idea that there was some change that resulted in the universe kind of doesn't make sense with a mechanism if the mechanism is changeless.
Yeah,
And
I see what you're
and
saying.
you said with a person, you said the person can be changeless, and yet through an act of the will, something give rise to the universe. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking of what would be an analogous situation with a mechanism. And I thought of like, if you think of like the formation of, let's say, a star. With the formation of a star, you have these principles of the universe in place, all the laws of physics and whatnot. And that stuff it hasn't changed since the formation of the universe. Like certain things have always been not eternal. Again, this is an analogy, so it's not really eternal. But if we have these properties of the universe that have the potential to give rise to a star, they give rise to a star at a certain point. Nothing has fundamentally changed about the nature of the universe. Just certain things happened that caused the creation of a star. Similarly, with God, nothing has fundamentally changed about his nature when he exercises his will to say, I'm creating a universe. In both cases, you can have an eternal state. In the one case, it's eternal personal being. In another case, it's eternal mechanism or properties. And in both cases, something happened that was not fundamental, but something happened. In one case, it was, I'm going to actually create a universe. In the other case, it was some unknown mechanism of some kind. And it seems like either one of those would work, and whatever objections you might raise to the mechanism of that analogy can similarly be applied to a God hypothesis.
I think that's actually a pretty good point. And I was thinking through, as you mentioned that, what some of the consequences would be of timeless circumstances and changeless circumstances. Because I think that the vocabulary we're using here can, at least for me, it can be kind of confusing in two different directions. So changeless, I think you're right. Like nothing changes about the essential properties of the universe. Like the laws of physics stay the same. Like the rate at which mass bends space-time is the same. So that's all true. And this does, I think, and this is where I think good objections can be raised, gets to what exactly is time and what we mean when we say timeless. And if that's even like some people don't even think that's a coherent concept. So that does kind of break down, I think. Because in one sense, you can think, and this isn't a perfect analogy, but you can think of like in some of those fiction stories where you can like sort of pause time and everything just freezes. So if you have, I like the star example because I think we said something similar about it last time. If you have like a huge nebula of hydrogen, it's just really big. Over time, it does start to kind of collapse into a singular point until fusion ignites and you have a star. But imagine you could just pause time and the hydrogen just stops. If time is paused, so to speak, the star is never going to form. It's just frozen. And this is, I guess, what I meant when I said timeless. That's like a better way to explain it. Timeless in that sense. There is no change in the sense of time. But you could make an objection, because I made this to myself as I was thinking what you were talking about. If I like pause time right now, and let's say I could still move around, whatever that would mean, I could sort of have a stopwatch and time how long time's been frozen, and then unpause time. And so in that sense, that's not even really timelessness. If timelessness, insofar as it's a coherent concept, it would only make sense to talk about it in the sense that it's true. Like no creation of time. You can't put a duration on that. It's so weird. So I think timelessness, and I said this last time, is not something we can be really well acquainted with as like temporal people. Like we experience the flow of time, whether you think it's tenseless or tensed.
So it's interesting, yeah, because I'm not really familiar with like the philosophical discussion of like, or the physics conversation of the nature of time. That is way past my scope of
past me too, yeah.
Anything I've studied. I've tried to read simple, even like layman physics books by like Neil deGrasse Tyson. Like they bore the heck out of me at a certain point
because it just doesn't really resonate. Oh. Yeah, I don't.
But so what I find interesting is that like we're talking about this thing, this like imagined reality, a timeless reality that is so different from our experience and so just out there is the only word I can think of. It's like, why are we even hypothesizing about what might be in this reality that is just like beyond our, it's, you know.
Yeah, that was an objection I raised to myself in the last video. I was like, it's such like an exotic and foreign idea to our everyday experience that it is hard to make sense of. And I think the appeal to the multiverse using that kind of framework is a potentially good objection, because even though a multiverse hypothesis is metaphysical, right? It's not really a science. It's not something you can test or observe. It at least involves generally known concepts like space-time, matter and energy, things like that.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I can kind of see an analogy with this multiverse idea with previous scientific discoveries, like the fact that we're not the only planet, or not the only solar system, or not the only galaxy. It's like if you sort of extrapolate outward, you can understand how that might be the case.
Yeah.
You know.
So I actually have a lot of sympathy with that sort of objection to this argument, and that's why I still hold that this isn't like compelling. It's not like this is such a good argument that you're like, I have to believe this. I think there's other rational positions to take. In this sense, the idea of believing in theism, I'm sort of using these arguments to give sort of, I guess we could say, rational permission, that it's not an irrational, like this also would be a coherent concept. Now, the thing about the multiverse that's interesting with relation to it being like a rational idea to take, especially with respect to what you talked about, how we used to believe we were the only solar system, and the only, like, we didn't know other stars had planets until like what, the 90s. It was a very recent discovery by Kepler's telescope. So yeah, a lot of that stuff's really recent, and so you kind of keep it. Well, actually, we discovered other galaxies before we discovered other planets, which is just weird to think about. But anyway, so eventually, it's not that far-fetched an idea to think there's other universes. And then even the idea of universe kind of breaks down, because when we say the word multiverse, that's kind of what we used to mean by universe. Like, we used to think the whole universe was the Milky Way, and then we discovered Andromeda. It's like, now, okay, there's other universes. So universe, the word just means kind of everything. So to speak.
Or cosmos.
Cosmos, yeah. And insofar as like nature's concerned, if there's other sort of space-times universes, if that's what we mean by that, which I think is what most physicists mean, an interesting difference between that kind of hypothesis and exoplanets or other galaxies is there's not going to be a way to empirically verify them according to what they're saying the hypothesis is. They're saying they are disconnected, unobservable universes. And there's nothing wrong with that, because, I mean, so is God, right? God's not something you can empirically verify either. And that's why I was candid to make that sort of, it's not any less, like, I hear a lot of theists do this. They'll say, like, the multiverse, that's just metaphysics, that's not science. But, like, so what? Like, God's not science either. So I think you have to put them in the same sort of conceptual playing field. And the question then is, okay, well, which philosophical analysis is better? And I think maintaining candor, I think a lot of that will depend on kind of personal preference for a lot of people. A lot of people that, like, if they're atheists, they're probably going to prefer multiverse. If they're theists, they're probably going to prefer the sort of agency causation idea. So I agree.
Can I ask you, like, what impact does it make? Like, does where you come down on this question make any difference at all? Any practical difference in anyone's life at all?
So I think I see the appeal to this question, because it seems like it's so abstract and metaphysical that, like, why does it matter, right? Because in a sort of a first impression practical sense, it doesn't. Like, it's not like me understanding the metaphysics of timeless and causality of agent. Like, what's that going to do, right? In sort of practical. So no, the short answer is no. But you could take a sort of, I guess, mental journey to see, okay, let's see where this would go. Let's say it's true that God's real. That is like a kind of proves that there's a reason to believe there's a God or something like that. And if God's real, let's say, this is all real hypothetical, but I don't know. It turns out that, like, Islam is true, and the ramifications of Islam being true has an impact on what their sort of eschatology is of the future, and blah blah blah. Like, if those were true, then that would matter. Now, obviously, I don't believe in Islam or anything like that, but clearly, like, 1.2 billion people do, And a lot of them use relatively similar reasoning to this to get there. In fact, this sort of cosmological argumentation in its current day sophistication came from medieval Islam, from Al-Ghazali and like I forget which century it was from. So like that, and even though it ties back to older forms of Judaism and believing the universe had a beginning, the sort of classic theism, like kind of monotheism concept, used this line of reasoning to get there in natural theology. So a lot of religions believe on basis like these, and they believe there's impact. So really it comes down to what's true. And then for me, since I'm taking a rational approach, not a sort of personal, experiential, religious approach, you go step at a time. So the next question would be to say, okay, let's say this is the case, like you said. If this really is the case, what impact does it have? The question would be, what's the next step, right? So if we're saying, okay, there is this sort of metaphysical ultimate that caused reality, that alone, no, doesn't mean anything. So we have to see, okay, what's an implication? What's the next rational step in terms of what we would be rational to believe? And then I think eventually, if you take enough steps, depending on who you ask. So if you ask a Muslim, they're eventually going to get to Islam. But you just say, okay, my rational belief is. Now, if you really believe something's true, like the Muslim believes Islam is true, they're going to behave according to the sort of practices and doctrines that it teaches. So in that sense, it has a pretty big impact.
Yeah, I agree. Like it in and of itself, like you said, it doesn't have much impact, but when you start narrowing down on specifics, it could potentially make a huge
So it really
impact.
depends on where the belief leads you, and you could go another direction. The good thing, this is good that it isn't true today, but people have done it. Let's say you have a sort of argument that leads to God does not exist. So you have an atheistic universe, and your reasoning process takes you down a sort of nihilistic path, and that affects your behavior. Like, there's definitely different avenues that your beliefs can take you, but the foundation.
Well, actually, interestingly, so if you follow the path of atheism and it leads you to nihilism, that's equally possible on a theistic.
Yeah. I'll give a hypothetical. You could have a theistic set of nihilistic ethics. Absolutely.
Right.
I actually think kind of the other side. I used Islam for the religious side, so I just kind of picked one. But
I was thinking recently that when it comes to like a deistic God, I think the most, like if you talk about a rational approach, the most rational conclusion, let's say if we grant that God exists. So I'll say I'm convinced that the first mover had to be a personal being. So I'm convinced of God. I think the most rational approach to who that God is definitely not the Bible-based Christianity, because that has so many irrationalities. But the most rational approach would be that a God exists who created us and set things into motion and let things be, doesn't communicate with us, doesn't want to communicate with us, wants us to figure things out for ourselves, wants us to realize that his destiny for the universe is to one day die a cold heat death, and he set things up this way, and he wants us in the meantime to we don't know what, but to basically figure it out for ourselves. Like that, if you just look around us, consider the nature of the universe that this unnamed God created, that seems to be his design, is for us not to know he exists for sure, and for us to be comfortable in this sort of project that he has going of this universe that was born and will one day die.
I actually agree with you. I think that is a very rational position, especially when you're just examining natural theology. In fact, that's kind of what deism is. It's a sort of detached theism. I actually don't know if that's what the D stands for, but that's what I'm gonna coin that. Aaron's coin, detached theism. I need to trademark that. But anyway, another interesting thing is what you said. You said, if I can repeat what you said correctly, he doesn't want to compel us that he exists. I actually think Christians believe that too. I don't know if Muslims believe that. Yeah, I don't know if Muslims believe that, but I do think Christians believe that God does not want to compel you that he exists. That he sort of exists at what I heard I forget which philosopher said, at an epistemic arm's length. That like the only people that would really find him are the people that would want to. Not all Christian denominations believe it, but I think most of them do. That's pretty
Yeah, I
mainstream Christian
think
belief.
the idea that people don't find God because they don't want to, that might be true in some instances. Like there might be some atheists who are like, look, I don't want God to exist. But there are a lot of atheists who are like, they have no problem with many aspects of even the Christian God, the loving God, the God who grants eternal life to his followers, the God who answers prayers, who intervenes in miraculous ways. Like, man, it's the idea that somebody would not want these things is ridiculous. It's like, of course I want those things.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of it. Now, maybe it's false, right? The Christians could just be wrong, but there's definitely a lot of texts in Scripture that Christian, like certain denomination and traditional doctrinal beliefs, will interpret as meaning. I think there's one in Hebrews that says like "draw near to God, and He will draw near to you," or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something in Romans. I'm not a scholar in this, but it talks about how God organized history in a way that all that would want to find Him will find Him, something like that. So that they base these beliefs off these kind of texts. Now they can
And it
be
has
wrong.
it has to be text based, like,
Hmm.
because if you can determine how true this following statement is. People don't find God because they don't want to find God. Like there's a way to test that. You can interview people, and granted, you can't read hearts, but like you can go a long way towards figuring out if someone doesn't believe in God because they don't want to know him.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. I mean I wasn't not that it's a bad thing, but I didn't know because the sort of defending theism and like Christian theism is a very specific set of beliefs and premises that you have to adopt. But if we're going down the sort of rationale, because it's one thing to say I accept a sort of authority of this text, and if the text teaches it, it has to be true. Like that's one way to do it, but the rationale is completely different. Like you can say I believe it because the text says so, but there isn't a generally good rationale to believe it, and then it just doesn't make sense to people. I think that's actually a problem the churches have in general. So what you're talking about is, yeah, the text might teach that, but it just doesn't make sense. We can make observations where people don't do this. And so a response to that is, as an individual, we obviously, I mean, we can't read people's minds. We don't really know. But an interesting thing that I've heard someone say is, let's say there's someone that's, they say they're sincerely seeking the truth. They would want it to be true, but they just can't rationally believe. Like there's just too many, like they have too many intellectual objections.
Mm.
One thing, the person's still alive, like whoever's talking to you, and so I heard this pastor say, like, I mean, you don't know that he won't end up there eventually. But another
Right.
thing is, and they're going to point to examples where exactly that has happened. And I mean, I think that's okay, but I mean, like you said, you can easily just point to deconversion examples. But
Mm.
on top of that, the degree at which people are hung up on intellectual objections, it le- while I do think you're right that the case of what you described exists, I think we're much more hard pressed to find that as a sort of example. Like when you think about the intellectual objections people have, which there's clearly plenty of them. There's a lot more, and maybe this is more anecdotal, but there's a lot more vitriol against Christian like tradition and beliefs in the secular community than there is like a sort of sincere. It's like, oh, this would be so great if it was true. Like I would be very hard pressed to find this example. Like I was reviewing a lot of other like sort of YouTube atheism. There's the Cosmic Skeptic. He's pretty popular. There's Aaron. Aaron's a good example. He's like the exact antithesis of what we're talking about right now. Not only
Mm-hmm.
does he not believe it's true, he doesn't want it. He calls himself an anti-theist.
Mm-hmm.
So,
But
um,
when he says that, does he mean like a deist, is he talking about a specific kind of God or more like a general God who loves everybody and everyone goes to heaven or whatever? Like,
that's an excellent question. So, I think,
because
and
I would have that attitude towards certain versions of God, even certain versions of Christianity. I would say, yeah, I don't want that to be true. Like that's ugly.
something, something I think is um, a, a direction you're going that I like is that like people might not a lot of the time appropriately understand what the proposition is. Like, so like say, and I think a Muslim would probably say the same thing, and a Christian would say the same thing, even though they think those things are different. But they don't understand the context of what the proposition is. Like, it gets caricatured a lot to say, like I saw this meme where Jesus is like knocking at a door. He's like, "Let me in," and the guy says, "Why?" He says, "So I can save you." And then he says, "From what?" And then Jesus says, "From what I'm gonna do to you if you don't let me in." Like, so people don't want that to be true. They're like, "This is dumb," right? So, but they think that's what Christianity is, and obviously the Christians don't see it this way. So like, there's these clashing contexts. And I think you could draw similar analogies from Islam. And we don't tend to see as many Islamic caricatures in the Western world, but I'm sure they exist. And like I've seen some. So the coherence of it matters, I think, and how people perceive it matters. And I think the perception, what you're talking about, is true, that even though they might be a minority, there are probably people that understand the perception as the believers see it and still don't believe. Like, they're sincere seekers after that, but they can't find the rational basis. And so my question ends up being, because I was kind of this person, at least I became this person along my timeline of seeking. So the question is, why? What's the thing in their way? What's blocking their like extra step? If they accept all the lines of, okay, I understand the Christian doctrine, it makes sense to me, and it would be great if this is true, and I'm seeking to find this sort of ultimate good in what Christians see as God, but I just can't rationally believe. Like, if you can find this person, I tend to say, like, okay, where is the rational cube missing? Because maybe they think it needs to be compelling. This is, I think, something that I ran into, because I thought if I couldn't believe it unless it would be irrational for me not to believe it. And this ties exactly back into the God being at epistemic arm's length. I don't think it has to be compelling, because then everyone would believe it, just like everyone believes other compelling things that our sense data gives us. Like, I think we're pretty compelled to believe that fire is hot or that the moon exists. Like, we're pretty compelled to believe these things. We don't have to sort of reason to them. And I think God's the same way. God's the exact opposite, where God's not going to be compelling. Just like you said, you can just observe people not clearly following these.
Isn't it interesting, though, that God set things up so that certain things are compelling? You said, like the moon, fire being hot, stuff like that. But the most important thing is not compelling. And so I wonder why a God would make like lesser things even more compelling than the most important thing of all, which is like the true nature of his existence and all that.
Yes, that's a really good question. And it probably depends on like which religious tradition you ask. Like, I actually don't know what the Muslim would say to that. Maybe they would say the same thing the Christian does. I know, and this ends up being a lot more Christian philosophy than like Christian theology, at least from what I've been reading. But I know some Christian philosophers have answered questions similar to the way you asked it. And you almost have to ask yourself, okay, what if we're going to try to be sincere about what the Christians believe and why they believe it, what do you think they would say? Like, what do you actually, like, I'm just curious, before I give you what I think they would say, I'm wondering what you think they would say.
So, what would they say? I think they might just say that God, I can think of it. I'm trying to figure out how to word it. Like,
because that's how I try to put, like, I'm trying to think of like what a Muslim would say, for example, but I don't really understand Muslim theology enough. But like, for people like the hypothetical person you described that understands and is seeking it but not finding it, I'm wondering what they think. Like, if they understand it, like, what do they think the Christian response is? And it could be that something like this, like, among many other examples, is one of their roadblocks. Like, maybe it just doesn't make sense to them, and they're just like, why is it this way? And I actually think, at least, I'm trying not to extrapolate my experience to a lot of other people, but I mean, we only really have our experience. This is something I ran into. I ran into a lot of like personal scruples over understanding these sort of macro ideas to make sense to me. Yeah. And a lot of the time I believe I was thinking about it wrong, because a lot of people have struggles with the idea that, like, in the Old Testament they had to sacrifice animals for sin, like they had to shed blood, like that just didn't make sense. Or why did Jesus have to die? Like a lot of these things, although you can quote things that make sense, when you start talking about an omnipotent God that created everything and kind of decides what rules there are, they start to think, okay, this doesn't make sense. And I believe I was thinking about it wrong when I had these same objections. Like when I think, okay, why would God create people at an epistemic arm's length for himself, but not for other things? Why would he make other things compelling? And for this objection to work for me to be rational, it has to be, I think, logically incoherent, which it seems like it is. So to see if it's really logically incoherent, I'm going to kind of appeal a little bit to something I mentioned in the last video about the sort of idea of possible world semantics. Would you say is there a possible world in which God achieves whatever his plan is for creating people by doing exactly that? Like, is that possible?
For him to create a world where he makes his existence just as obvious as the sky being blue, while accomplishing what?
Let me word it a different way. Okay, so the Westminster Confession says, and I'm going to summarize it, that the purpose for life, or the meaning to life, is for people to come to freely find God, right? Because God is supposed to be the ultimate good, and it has to be free. Like, they're not going to be compelled to do it. So the question was more, is it possible that in this sort of world where God creates a natural world that we're compelled exists, but he's at an epistemic arm's length and we have to find him, is it possible that that world maximizes the number of people that find him? Now, I don't know that's true. I can't prove that. But I can at least conceive of, that seems possibly true. Like, I don't see any incoherence in this. And if that's possibly true, then in the possible world semantics, there is some possible world where exactly that happens. And so the Christians just believe that that's this world. And their reasons for believing that's obviously more theological with Scripture. But in terms of you and me, as long as that's possible, we can't say it's illogical for it to happen, because then it just have to be impossible. And
for me,
okay.
I know earlier, if I can go back to something you said earlier, when you talked about how you think it's just personal preference, whether or not it's the first cause of the universe is personal or mechanical. Is that right?
Oh, okay. I actually didn't finish that line of thought, but I did say that, but I'm not saying that that's in a sort of justifying way, like you can just pick what you like. I'm saying it in a sort of observation, people tend to go that way.
Okay.
Like the data suggests it, right? I'm not making a causality, like, because that, but it's more of a correlation. It does seem to be that your background will influence which one you pick, so to speak. I don't think in a literal sense we choose it, but
for me, the language of preference kind of assumes that there's two things that you have to choose. Like, I prefer this over this. And for me, when I look at the two possibilities, like some unknown natural mechanistic process and some personal being, like, I prefer neither. Like, preference isn't even an issue, because they're both equally, in my mind, explanatory and unprovable, and something that we can neither verify or falsify. They're equally that. So for me, I'm just like, I prefer neither.
Yeah, I believe you too. I don't think it's necessary to prefer one, but something I've noticed is people, like, let's say first people that might, like, why might an atheist prefer not theism? Like, let's say he's a sincere seeker of truth. It's not because he necessarily doesn't want theism to be true, or maybe, but let's say he has a system of beliefs. He or she has a system of beliefs where they believe if God exists, and it implied, say, Christianity was true, that there are things about Christianity that they find repulsive and they think would be awful to be true. Like, we can think of worlds we wouldn't want to exist, and maybe that's one of them. Or on the flip side, the Christian thinks that they think it would imply nihilism, because a lot of Christians seem to think this, that atheism implies nihilism, and they think that's worse than a world where there's an ultimate good being and something like that. So they're going to prefer that. Like, I think that's at least, like, I'm trying to be honest with myself. Like, I like to think of myself as a rational person, and I'm like being objective with the evidence, but there's probably some degree of unconscious preference deep down in me from experiences or how I was raised. I'm willing to admit that's possible. But when we talk about these kind of things, we want to try the best we can, at least I do, to be like the perfectly rational brain. right? Like, what would be the best analysis? And obviously, that's going to be hard to some degree because we're cognitively limited, and we
Yeah.
are somewhat controlled by how our chemical makeup is, which involves experience and emotion and things like that.
Yeah, I look at it like it's not attainable. Like perfect objectivity is not attainable because
Yeah,
we're
I agree.
subjective beings, but it's sort of like an asymptote in math where you're getting closer and closer and closer, even if you never can never quite touch it.
Exactly.
And like I think there are things we can do to get closer to objectivity, even if we can never fully achieve it, you
What
know.
I think what you and I are doing right now is a good example of it. Like the fact that we
Hmm.
can recognize that we can't be objective is a step closer. And even though when I mentioned the preference, I don't think in a sort of literal sense it's a preference that you just pick one, because I think your beliefs will push you down a certain direction. But that isn't to say that I don't think one is a stronger analysis than the other. I mean, because otherwise I would believe neither, like you, or I would believe the other one, like the people that believe that one. So if I thought they were literally equal and I was agnostic about it, I wouldn't be a theist. But so just by the nature of me being a theist, I clearly believe one, at least insofar as I'm offering it as a justification for believing. I find it a slightly better analysis. But it does involve a sort of system of beliefs that I think most people don't share that don't believe it. It's going to be hard to find someone that shares the entire system of my
So
beliefs of these principles and assumptions and still don't reach the conclusion. Well, I think it's possible. I think that those people exist and they're probably philosophers. Uh, it's usually when you arriving at different conclusions usually means you took a different path. So people taking my path and arriving at different conclusions, while it's possible, I think it's much more rare. And so I always try to get down at, okay, where is the assumption breakdown at? Like which axioms are different? And I tried to do that in the last video. And I think we sort of had a lot of similar ones, but I think you were exploring. You were like, okay, I'm going to grant some of these because I want to kind of see where that goes. And it might be the case. You know, I'm willing to admit that it's even given my assumptions, maybe my conclusions aren't as rational. But insofar as I'm like putting the pieces together, this one seems more stable to me. I'm not certain, like you said, I'm not certain at all. But like if I'm taking non-theism and theism, and I'm looking at like what I see as the evidence and like my prior assumptions, it seems like theism is just a heavier scale tip. Like that's kind of how I see
yeah.
it.
So for me, like when you say I'm not certain at all, if I were to be in your shoes and I were to my scales were to be tipped in that direction of theism, like it would be an overstatement to say I'm not certain at all. Like it's not just that I'm
Okay,
not
yeah,
like
that's a good
like
point.
it, and another way I look at it is like the further removed you are from something, the less certain you can be. Especially when it comes to something like the nature, like the cause of the universe. Like we're pretty certain of the nature of Earth, the composition of Earth. We're a little less certain of the composition of an exoplanet in another solar system. We're even less certain about the nature of another galaxy. Beyond, like the further out you get, you're way less certain. And with this issue, we're talking about something that is so remotely removed from our experience that like the level of certainty we can have, no matter what side you come down on, if any, is
It's low.
so
Yeah.
low. Yeah.
I not only do I agree with that, but I think I actually don't think anything is 100% certain, except maybe the sort of Cartesian idea of the self. Maybe like I exist. I might be certain of that, but I'm not certain that the objective world's real any more than I'm not certain that the past is real. Like my degree is high on those, but I wouldn't say none of them are, because I can conceive of logically consistent ideas where those are false. So I'm not certain of any of those. And I'll agree with you that the God principle that we're arguing here for, the certainty, even if it tips over 50%, is still low. So I'll agree with that. And my agreement with that, because I think where maybe you're going is like it's kind of hard to get from that to like a religion, which seems for a lot of people involves a lot of certainty. So that leap is really big. And for me, I think the certainty, the low, like the scale tip that I mentioned, is just this one argument. Like if this is all you have, yeah, there's like no way. Like maybe you're a kind of a deist. Like I think, I'm trying to think of a good example where it's like I think a lot of people believe that like certain random things about like really distant galaxies. Like they're like, yeah, I mean that's probably out there. I mean, I don't really know though. Like that'd be kind of how I would approach theism. I would be a deist in that sense if this is all I had. But this isn't all I have. Like I mean, it's just one piece of a larger cumulative puzzle.
This is where it starts, you would
Yeah,
say.
I think what if I had to pick one foundational like inclination to consider theism, I would probably pick this one
Okay.
because it, especially for us today with the science, like it'd be much harder to be a theist on these grounds in like the 1800s or like during the Enlightenment, because the mainstream scientific belief was the exact opposite. Like everyone thought the universe was eternal and static and changeless, so to speak, and it was just always there, and God was superfluous, and you could shave it away with Occam's razor. So it's a lot
So I'm
easier
in,
today to believe something like that than it used to be.
I'm interested in knowing what's your next step. Like if this is your sort of starting point, like
Well,
I'm interested in hearing for you where you go from here.
well, what I'll tell you, because this is the kind of question I would want next, is that this isn't exactly what happened with me. I don't think anyone ever. Life's a lot more stumbly than what we'd like to think is this perfectly straight rational trail. So even though this didn't literally happen to me, this is the rationale. I'll just give you the rationale. So for me, this would be the sort of inclination, and then I would examine all of the other natural theology arguments and see, okay, which of these are also rational to hold, not necessarily compelling. And then as you kind of throw them onto the scale just tips more and more. It'll never be at 100%. I don't think it's going to, like, it's not that there just won't be a scale. I think there will always be a thing. But in terms of the next
Like
step,
let's
oh, go ahead.
say we're trying to build on this foundation of some God exists, and we say I want to determine whether or not this God um, has our goodwill in mind, our well being in mind. That he's he wants us to benefit in somehow. He wants us to know pleasure rather than pain, like a omnibenevolent God
Yeah.
exists who has
Yeah.
goodwill towards His creation, or not. Like I'm trying to figure out which one of those is more rational. Like how do you answer
Okay.
that? How do you go about figuring out?
Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to skip over other ontological style reasons, like things that it exists, because now we're getting from, okay, maybe it's there, but why think it wants good things, or why think it's good? So I'll skip over those because there are more. I just the one that seems to convince me more is the sort of initial one that we went over. So if we're going to get into that, it seems like your question has two directions. One is the first part of what you asked: how do we know it wants something good for us, or what its goal is? And I actually think with natural theology you can't derive this. Like, and if you can, I don't know what it is. Like, I haven't found or can conceive of a natural theology argument that gets you to, therefore God's purpose for life is this. And it would be real convoluted. Like, maybe
It
you
would.
could construct it, but it'd be super contrived. So I
Because
don't.
what are you going to do? Like you're going to point to the positive evidence that He wants our good. I mean, we're able to experience pleasure and so forth. But you can, for every pleasurable experience, you could point to 100 other non-pleasurable, painful, traumatic experiences and say, "Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Isn't it obvious that He doesn't want our
Yeah.
good?"
So I'm going to try, right? So I'm going to try to use a rationale just with natural theology, so there's no religion or anything. Because I can conceive of a way to get there. It's a little convoluted, so you're going to have to bear with me. The second part that the question addressed, which I think is needed to go down this convoluted path, is the intrinsic goodness of this ultimate reality that we're calling God. Because I don't think it's not on the surface inference of the first argument, right? It's like there's nothing about the idea that this thing is just like a sort of metaphysical first cause that you get from that to the omnibenevolence. So this requires, I think, although I think it's rational, it requires a lot more philosophical justification and analyzing this and what it means. And by the way, none of what I'm saying so far, nothing I've said so far between now and this last video is some cockamamie new theory that I'm coming up with. This is all like pretty established natural theology and philosophy that's been around for a while. So I just want to throw that out there. There are some sort of Aaron originals that maybe we'll get to someday, but as I'm piecing this together, arriving at the sort of moral maximum that this thing is supposed to be requires, at least it did for me, a sort of understanding of what the ethical, like the ethical dilemma is in the philosophy of ethics. And one of the considerably unsolved problems in philosophy is the sort of ethical grounding of reality. I mean, a lot of people have theories that they believe in, but in sort of the sort of mainstream consensus, without presupposing theism, it's considered a sort of unsolved thing, kind of like the knowledge problem from Plato. Like, what is knowledge exactly? So the same thing is true. Like, we can have beliefs about objective morality, but we don't have a clear description of what grounds its objectivity in the world. So this gets super convoluted, and I don't know anyone in the audience listening, if this doesn't make a lot of sense, I apologize, because I'm not a philosopher or academic, so my ability to explain this is going to be very limited.
All right, just before you get into that, I'm just going to give a 10-minute warning to everyone because I got to head out in about 10 minutes.
Cool.
So, but go ahead, yeah.
So understanding what that means, I mean, we all have moral experience. We experience things that we think we can perceive as clearly good or evil, or maybe you don't want to use those words, like things that are clearly wrong. Like, I think we can find a clear moral distinction between, like, loving a child and nurturing the child, instead of torturing or abusing a child. Like, we can see clear differences, right? Now, we might not always be able to perceive all things clearly. Maybe there's gray areas, but what the appeal is in the sort of moral ontology, which is morality is an objective thing in the world, that it's not just this byproduct of our reality any more than the truth of what those statements I just said were, is that what makes it true in reality is like what grounds it. It's been the sort of mystery, right? So theism has always appealed to God as this, that God is I think Plato called what he saw as the demiurge, as the sonum bonum, or like the ultimate good. I might not be pronouncing that right, but I'm trying to think of a good way to explain it, but it's called paradigm theory, that God is the paradigm of goodness, right? And an example I heard is, and I think I used it in the last video for a different context, is the meter bar in Paris. So if the meter bar in Paris is the paradigm of a meter, it doesn't make sense to ask, why is the meter bar a meter long if it's the paradigm of a meter? It's not conforming to some abstract length of a meter. It just is the definition of a meter. And so theism, the traditional sense of theism that sees God as, when they say God is good, they don't mean that he's good in the same way we see a good person as good, which is that they're conforming to a good standard, and they're closer to that standard than other people. That God is the standard. God is his essential nature that's necessary to what it means to be God is the.
I see what you're saying. A question comes to mind. So when you say God is the standard, but it begs the question, what is the standard?
So this gets into,
you know what I mean? Like, the standard could be you treat people with love and kindness, or the standard could be, conversely, you treat people with malice and hatred. Like, how do we know what the standard is?
Yeah, this is similar, not quite exact. This is similar to what's called the Euthyphro dilemma, which is a dialogue by Plato. And the Euthyphro dilemma is Socrates arguing with Euthyphro, if I remember right. And they referring to the gods, but you can say God, either one, about being pious or being good. And say, the Euthyphro dilemma is, does God command something or will something because it is good? Or is it good because God wills it or commands it? That's the dilemma, right? So you got to pick one. And the dilemma is because no matter which one you pick, God, the good is either arbitrary or independent of God, right? And so you don't get this sort of full-fleshed omnibenevolence. So that's what the Euthyphro dilemma is supposed to be. And the problem with this dilemma is it's clearly not a real dilemma, because dilemma means A or not A. But this is offering an A and a B. It's not offering a non-A alternative. It's not saying, it would have to say something like, is something good because God wills it, or is it not the case that something's good? Like, that would be a dilemma. Like, you have to pick one, but they're offering two different ones. So that means there could just be C or D, or there could just be more. And so this is where paradigm theory gets out of this dilemma. Is it's neat. We're not saying God doesn't. First of all, we shouldn't use will or command, because at best that argument would say it's independent of a command, which I think is true. But something isn't good independent of God if God is goodness as the paradigm. this gets into what you brought up in your question, which is the difference between a standard, a sort of like what's our obligation to do this or not this, and the value, right? So a moral obligation and a moral value aren't identical. Like, it can be morally valuable to love, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're obligated to love if you don't have an imperative to do so. So obligations come from imperatives issued by some competent authority. Like, that's what an imperative is. So what would be our imperative to do what is good instead of what is evil would be whatever those imperatives are. And there's a lot of different theories on that. Divine command theory might be the most talked about, which is like, not only is God the essential good paradigm, but God commands us to do the good thing. So that's sort of where the imperative comes from. But I don't think a lot of people hold into that. At least they don't argue for it today. But in terms of standard, it's more about value, like what is essentially valuable. And if God is supposed to be the paradigm of moral value, then whatever is closer to the way God is more, it's more good than. Does that make sense? I don't know. This is what paradigm theory states.
So my question though is, what is what did you just? How did you just phrase it? You said whatever's closer.
The paradigm theory states that God is the paradigm of moral value.
The
way God essentially is, right? And what we experience in our moral experience in the world, of experiencing things that we can clearly perceive as better than evil, like the example I gave. You could think of other examples. We might be fallible in discerning the differences in those differences. Sorry, I think I had a fire alarm go off, but it's over now. So the differences between that, we as fallible people might not always be able to perceive it, but we can know that there is an objective good and evil in that sense, so to speak, even if we don't always know exactly what it is. And the theory.
Well, I think what we know, we don't know that there's an objective good and evil. We know that as humans, we have certain moral preferences.
Yeah,
but
that's true, and that's kind of the difference that I was saying. So there are people that just don't accept that theory. I agree. Like, they don't think there is objective morality, and like, you have to argue there first. And that's actually that's one argument people offer for God, is that like you can argue from like the reality of objective morality to God existing if you have that paradigm connection. It's a lot more convoluted, obviously, but
yeah, I mean, when people talk about objective morality, they proceed to argue for objective morality by arguing that as humans we clearly have certain moral preferences. And my thing is, that says nothing about objective reality, and you're just basically describing what's true of human nature, that there are certain things that we prefer as a species. And I'm like, what does that have to do with the nature of this of God? Like, God can be completely different from that. His nature, his moral preferences could be the exact opposite of what we prefer as a species. And how do we know? How do we figure out what his nature is?
I used to try to argue this way too, and I see the appeal. The problem is I kept finding myself in pretty uncomfortable circumstances where I would have to like admit things that I clearly don't believe. Like, let me give I heard a good example once. A lot of people, when you start talking about ethics and stuff, inevitably the Holocaust comes into play. I've just noticed this all the time. And one example I've noticed is, let's say Germany won World War II, and they were successful in globally exterminating or brainwashing everyone that disagreed with their like sort of point of view, and they made this master race or whatever. That way everyone believed the Holocaust was good. According to like objective morality theory, like what that means is to say it would still have been wrong even if everyone believed it was true. Like that, like that's to say it is objectively wrong. So
right.
That's
if you define wrong a certain way, if you have an objective definition of right and wrong, and you compare a certain given action to that standard, then yeah, it doesn't meet the definition. It's therefore objectively wrong. But I don't know what this has to do with the nature of God.
Well, so that all by itself, nothing. It doesn't have anything to do with it. But what a reasoning process that's used is, okay, if you can establish there is a sort of objective morality, that they can make a sort of premise step from there to God existing on that paradigm theory that I explained. And the reasoning process there is more about, we have moral experience. And so we reflect on the moral experience, and we're able to perceive infallibly, but we're able to perceive things that are clearly morally valuable, like moral values and moral vices. Like we can perceive that there is a sort of a reality of that, and we see parts of it
A reality of what exactly?
of objective moral value. So, for example, when I say fallibly, let's say we can clearly perceive an objective moral difference between the first example I gave of loving a child and nurturing it, than like abusing and torturing a child. Like we can see an objective, clear difference, not merely in the physical constituents of what's going on, but that there's a moral component to it. It's not like a difference between trying to chisel a rock with this kind of hammer or this kind of hammer, and then it chisels it differently. Like there's like a moral component to it. Like the fact that we can perceive this in our moral experience with it can give us justifiable grounds to believe that there's a sort of morally objective realm independent of us.
When you say there's a moral component to it, what do you mean?
So, well, it was a really weird example, but think about, I mean, how we define some of these things contingently might not make sense. I'm trying not to get too abstract with it, but an often used example is like in the animal kingdom, there's often say that they're not moral agents, so there's no moral agency to the actions they take. So, like when a lion kills a zebra, like it'll kill the zebra, but it doesn't murder the zebra. There's no moral connotation to that. Whereas, like you and I have certain moral obligations to each other not to do things like that. And the claim, like this isn't the argument, but the claim is that there's more to that than merely just survival aspect. Like it would be wrong to do it. Now, I'll admit, not everyone believes that.
What do you mean by wrong to do it?
That it has an objective and mind and opinion independent reality that makes it true that it would be wrong to do that. Just like
what is that reality?
So the theist believes that reality is God, not God's command, but God Himself. Now, God.
You see, what I would say that objective reality, because I agree, there's something more to it, but that something more that I could see is human nature. That there is something about the pro-social aspect of human nature that objectively, because of the way our species is psychologically has evolved as a social species, objectively there are certain things that make us cringe, and that's the object. Like there is objective morality. It's objective to the unique pro-social predispositions that all of us have as the unique primate species we are. That's the object. And like that, when you say that God is actually the object, I'm like, okay, show me. You know what I mean? Like I can observe that this object that I'm telling you, this object of pro-social human predispositions, I can see that exists. Humans exist, pro-social instincts exist. Not just in humans, but in other advanced primates. I can see that. Like it's something that exists. It's something that I can actually verify. So when I speak of objective morality and that being the object, it's observable. When you speak of God being the object, it's not verifiable. It's not observable. It's not something that we can.
Well, no, you're right. And our need for the sort of observation, verification, testing, this sort of science method, I agree, wouldn't work. Like it just, and ultimately it ends up not working for any kind of objective moral theory that tries to ground it in reality, independent of our preferences and minds. Even what you said will break down on a sort of physics level, because ultimately where we're placing the value ends up being a rather arbitrary chemical process of physics. And this is
so I agree. So what I just said, it was not prescriptive. It's more descriptive.
Yes.
It's describing where these objective moral sort of sensations that something is objective, like where it comes from, describing where it comes from.
Mm-hmm. It is.
I agree that it's not a prescriptive model.
Here's why the objection that I raised potentially works with it being descriptive. Because if it was prescriptive somehow, we just have to say, okay, is it successfully prescriptive? But since you admit it's not prescriptive, the reason the objection works is because the moral experience we reflect on is prescriptive. Now, if we say it's not, if it's merely descriptive, if people are willing to admit that, I think that gets out of the argument I'm offering and the objection I'm offering. If we're saying no, morality isn't prescriptive, it is descriptive. It's just a description of what we observe. But that's not a moral claim any more than the lack of moral agency that the examples I gave were. It's You
Hmm.
can describe what animals do just the same, and there's no moral agency to it. Now, I think people there is a position, and it's okay to take this. When I say it's okay, I mean it's rational. Like, people take it that there just is no moral agency. That's just a useful device that human society has constructed to aid survival, and a
You
lot of
see,
people believe that.
I kind of disagree with that in the
I do
sense
too.
that
Yeah,
it's not just a human construct. Like it may be that, but it's not just that. It's not merely a human construct for this reason, is because of the foundation of human nature. Is because there are certain inclinations that we have all evolved over millions of years that are so embedded in who we are that that's the basis upon which we go on to build constructs like, right and wrong, but it has a deep founded basis and
yes,
something that we feel so innately.
I agree.
And so it's,
That's kind of what
so
humanism is. That the descriptions of where we get like the behavior prescriptions is built upon a foundation of value, and in humanism, it's human beings, right? It's our reality. But I think they kind of take it for granted a bit, and I like it. It just you just start at human beings, and then an often a response to that is, well, you're just making God, right? Like, there's really no difference there. But there is a slight difference in that it's inferring to God. It's not a starting with God, because we see these prescriptive values as properties of people, of agents, and this is where the paradigm theory comes. So really, at the end of the day, it's just rejecting you got to reject paradigm theory which implicitly that's what this is a rejection of it. But insofar as paradigm theory is coherent, that the paradigm of moral value that makes it objective is the sort of logical maximum of these moral prescription character traits. So, like, whatever the logical maximum is of all these moral values, that's just by definition what God is. God is that. And like, if you can conceive of something greater than that, that's God. Like, whatever
I mean, but that's just a assertion. Like maybe God is that, maybe he's not. Maybe
well,
he
I
is
mean,
the exact
it's
opposite.
not an assertion insofar as we're defining it any more than me saying a bachelor isn't a married person is an assertion. Like, if we're saying, okay, by concept, we're trying to see, is this thing real? And like, what is the thing? Well, this thing is the paradigm of moral value, the first cause of all contingent reality, whatever we're defining it as. I'm not like asserting God exists and that's what he is. I'm saying, like, does that thing exist, like as I've described it? And the inference to that, insofar as we're talking about like sort of ethical theory, is our reflection of moral experience of prescriptive objective reality. And insofar as paradigm theory makes sense from what I described there, it's a sort of rational extrapolation to that logical
I see.
ultimate.
Yeah, I see what you're
Yeah.
saying.
Now,
It sounds like you're
it
saying that we have a moral experience as humans, and God, you're sort of extrapolating from that and saying God is the maximum of that moral
well,
experience.
and one more step. That's true. And then the extra step is that ultimate reality is the grounding foundation that makes my experience objective and not subjective. That's the sort of
Mhm.
step. And where you can get out of this argument is saying, well, you can just deny that we have the experience. Like, you can say, no, we don't have a prescriptive moral experience. It's descriptive, or it's just arbitrary, or or you can do both. You can kind of just reject this sort of paradigm theory. I mean, I think the paradigm theory is, at least, it's a rational concept. Like, there's nothing contradictory about what I said, but you can just deny it. But insofar as you have those two steps, so to speak, that's where you can derive this being's ultimate objectivity there. Now, an interesting objection you can make is, well, why think that being and then the first cause being are the same being? Like, why just make that leap? And a quick
Well,
response you
I
can.
got. I'm sorry. I
Oh,
don't
you're
want
good.
to cut you off, but yeah, I got to dip out of here. Um, I hate to cut it off at this point because it's such a good conversation, but
Yeah,
maybe we can pick it up here at some point.
yeah, we can definitely pick up where we left off, and I'm sure we'll think through kind of and construct back. Because I had no idea we'd get into sort of ethical theory, because it's real. I'm not as informed on um, the philosophy of ethics and stuff, but I think moral philosophy is interesting, and it's a lot more than just, okay, this dilemma, is this the right thing or wrong thing to do? It's like we're talking about like the foundation of moral value. It's a lot more complex, but yeah, we can pick it up another time.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't want to get more into it because
We'll go to
you
30
can talk a
minutes.
long time.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
All right. Well,
but
I'll talk to you again. We can pick up right where we left off.
all right, man. Good conversation. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Good. All right. I'll see you later.